Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Frontend Love virtual meetup. I'm excited to have you. Today we have Robert. Let me pull him up on screen.
Hello.
Hi, Robert. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Yeah, very well. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for being able to give a talk today. You're going to talk about advanced fiddler techniques.
That's
Um,
correct.
could you give a little bit more of a background about yourself and what you're going to talk about today?
Yeah, so I'm a full-time e-commerce developer. So I work for a company and do that. And so I'm constantly troubleshooting problems that happen on our website. And so years ago, I started to use Fiddler. And back then, I started doing presentations on it, and very few people in the audience actually had used it. These days, when I ask, practically everyone in the room says they've used Fiddler. But when I probe and ask how they use it for very basic things. And so there's a lot of features that are built into Fiddler that people are just not familiar with that I use every day to help me troubleshoot my own website. So I just wanted to share what those were.
Okay, that's pretty cool. Well, I don't want to keep you any longer because you have quite an extended presentation prepared for everybody. Please, Robert, take it away and good luck.
Okay, thank you very much. I won't spend a lot of time on this. I do have the slides are going to be available. I have a link at the end that has the slides and the code. But like I said, I'm a full-time e-commerce developer. I also do conference speaking. I'm a Pluralsight author. I've got a number of Fiddler-specific courses and some other courses on performance and cryptography and things. That is my Twitter, my email, and my blog information. And like I said, at the very end, you'll have access to a link for the slides and such. So when we talk about Fiddler, we're going to focus on HTTP, the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. So this is the protocol used between web browsers and servers. I gave you the links here where you can go actually read the specs. They're actually pretty readable, and there have been times where I needed to dig into, for instance, how does caching work? And you can actually go in here and read about how it was supposed to work. So it's helpful to be able to dig in and get the source of truth, so you can look at those too. And it's also a request and a response paradigm, which we'll see. And we'll see that the requests and responses both are made up of headers and the body section. So that's going to come into play a lot as we go through troubleshooting here. So what is Fiddler? So Fiddler is a tracing tool that was built specifically for HTTP or HTTPS. Eric Lawrence was actually working on the clip art team for Microsoft. And people would order clip art years ago, and they would try to download it and something wouldn't work. So they would call his staff, and he noticed that there were no good troubleshooting tools at the time. So back then, the Microsoft tool you'd probably use is Netmon. There's also, obviously today, Wireshark and other tools that can do those kinds of things. But the problem with those is they're very packet specific. What I like about Fiddler is it rolls it up to a request and a response, more logical for HTTP and HTTPS. But Eric noticed there wasn't something convenient for people to use. He didn't know HTTP, he didn't know C#, he didn't know .NET. He got a bunch of books and spent a lot of weekends and years adding into the tool, which I think is awesome. It was acquired by Telerik in 2012, which is now owned by Progress. And I gave you a link there for where you can get Fiddler. So Fiddler is free to download. I'm going to talk a little later. I'm going to be showing what they now call Fiddler Classic, which most of you are familiar with. Only runs on Windows. They're also working on Fiddler Everywhere, which in the future is going to be able to run multi-platform. So let's look at how does Fiddler work. So by default, I'm just going to go to my browser. And if I go look at my settings, I'm going to go into System and open up my proxy settings. And you'll notice when I first start, I'm using Edge. The new Edge is awesome, by the way. I'm using Edge, and right now there's no proxy set. So what I do now, if I start up Fiddler, so I've downloaded, I've installed Fiddler. If I open that up and we go back and look at what that does, it's actually gone and changed the Windows system proxy settings. So if you notice here, If you've ever seen the t-shirt, there's no place like 127.0.0.1. There's no place like home. So this actually points to my own machine. So this is basically saying any traffic that I see now coming from my browser, I want you to force it through this local IP address and port 8888, which is the default port that Fiddler runs on. And if I move over a little bit, you can see it's HTTPS as well. So why that's important, a lot of people will use tools. It's great. Modern browsers will just pick up these Windows system settings and automatically send your traffic through Fiddler so you can diagnose problems. If you do run some other software and it's not showing up in Fiddler, you just have to understand that Fiddler is running as a proxy, so it's sitting between the browser and the server. So you may have to manually configure proxy settings in your application. I'll show you later. I'm a .NET developer, how I can force .NET classes to use a proxy. But by default, if you're just trying to troubleshoot websites, modern browsers will automatically pick up that setting. Now, if I go and hit some pages, so I just created a fictional travel site. I'm just running it on my own machine here. Now that I have Fiddler running and it's being proxied, you can see that those requests are now coming through and can be viewed by Fiddler. And so I assume a lot of you have seen Fiddler before, but in case you haven't, this is the actual request for the web page. You see I've got a couple CSS files, a couple JavaScript files, and a bunch of images. So again, this is where we'll spend our time today going through this, but it's important to understand that if you're having issues and the tool you want to troubleshoot with is not being seen in Fiddler, just remember it's a proxy and you may need to set your proxy settings manually. Within Fiddler, the term for each individual item is a web session. So that's just a single request and a response. And there's actually a lot of things that we can do on a web session. I will often do troubleshooting and I will work with either my operations department, other developers, potentially even a third-party vendor. So I will often want to go in and mark individual sessions or even add comments. So let's look at how to do that. So here, let's say this Bootstrap, maybe I decided this was the wrong version. I can come and mark this as orange and put a comment on it and just say, we really need to upgrade this. Now, when I send this to someone else, I'll show you how to save in a bit. I can actually transmit this whole Fiddler trace to them. They'll be able to come in and see, oh, the orange is what you're talking about. They can go over to the right, add the comments, and be able to see what I had said about that particular entry. Another thing I can do is search. So if I notice down here, I see that there's a Halflings font. And as I'm thinking back, I don't remember using that in my own HTML. So I wondered, why is this being requested? So what I can do is say I want to find sessions, and I'll just type in Halflings and hit enter. And it did what I expected. It found the actual font request and highlighted it, but it still didn't tell me where it came from. So one of the things to be aware with in Fiddler, I do a lot of performance work. All of my content's actually compressed. I need to make sure I check. It took me years to find this, actually. I need to say decode compressed content. Now, if I search again, you'll see it actually found that it was from Bootstrap. So on my e-commerce site, I may pull in various CSS sheets or content from other people. This helps me track down, why is this being requested? Another cool thing I can do, I can actually just right-click on the file and say, please select the parent request. And you'll see it also identifies Bootstrap. So just a couple quick hints on how to search and find things on a really big site. Sometimes it's hard to know who's actually pulling that file in. Why was it being requested? That's a quick way to find out. Another cool feature not many people know in Fiddler is I can actually look for, if I want to see all the CSS files, I can actually hold the Alt key. And if I click on any individual column here, like this text CSS, it's actually going to highlight all of the entries that have that same setting. So if I do the same for JPEG, I'm just going to hold down Alt. So it's just a quick way to identify all of the web sessions that have that same value for that column. Again, I just have to hold down the Alt key while I do that. Now we'll talk about decrypting HTTPS. There's two. So HTTPS is just the HTTP protocol running on top of, hopefully not on top of SSL. You want to be using TLS at least 1.2 today. But what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to troubleshoot a site that uses HTTPS. And so the whole purpose of HTTPS is to make sure that people that are in the middle can't read my content. So how is it that Fiddler would be able to do that? So I'm going to show you how to do that in Fiddler. So let me clear this out. And I'm just going to hit a site that uses HTTPS. We'll go to Bing. And if I look at what I see in Fiddler, you can see I just have it says tunnel to bing.com. So it knows it established an HTTP connection to these three hosts, but I can't see any of the content, right? I can't troubleshoot. I can see some of the headers, but I can't see the actual content I want to see. Even though Fiddler sits between the browser and the server, I can actually go into Tools, Options, HTTPS, and I can say I want to decrypt HTTPS traffic. So at first, this should kind of disturb you, right? The whole purpose of HTTPS is so people can't do this. Well, Fiddler came up with a good idea for this. They're going to ask me, and you'll see that's going to do a number of prompts. Because it's sitting between me, the browser, and the server, and in between there, Fiddler is going to create its own root certificate. So now it's saying, will you trust Fiddler's root certificate? I'm going to say yes. And again, it says, hey, are you sure you want to do this? I'm going to say yes. And once again, do you want to do this? Yes, I do. And so now it's added that root certificate. So now what happens is when I go back and visit Bing, I'm actually going to hit OK. I'm just going to close and restart this to make sure it picks that up. And typically I do that once and then it's there all the time for me. I can hit Control F5. Now, if I go back, you can see here's my request to Bing, and it's not just the tunnel anymore. I can see all of the actual requests. So if I take the compression off and look at the raw view, now I can see all the content. So again, that seems really odd, but what I've done is I've said I want to trust Fiddler, and so it has created, if I go in and look at my certificate manager, if I go into personal certificates, you'll see this do not trust. So that is the Fiddler root certificate. If you know how HTTPS works, certificate authority will issue the web server a certificate that's signed by them. So this allows me, since I trust it, you notice it created a certificate that looks like bing.com. So now in my browser, when I go and hit that, if I hit F12 and we go to the security tab, you'll see it has a valid certificate from Do Not Trust Fiddler. So that's the certificate authority that Fiddler used to make this certificate. Then what Fiddler does is when it goes out to actual Bing, it gets Bing's real server certificate and re-encrypts. So it's safe over the wire, but because I've set this up and configured on just my machine, now I can intercept all of that traffic and still troubleshoot HTTPS. So this was a great addition years ago. You'd be stuck otherwise. You wouldn't be able to troubleshoot and see the network requests. So that's really cool. We'll take a look at some of the filters that are available. So let me close a couple of these. So there's a filters tab here that lets me do some really basic filtering of the requests that come back and forth. So I'm just going to say, let's use filters. First thing I can do is if I only want to see certain hosts, I can just type in here, for instance, I only want to see www.bing.com. So all of the other requests that are made, I can choose to ignore. I could also come and say I only want to see traffic from, and it lists everything running on my machine. So sometimes you'll notice when you're doing tracing, you're going to get a lot of different HTTP requests from a lot of services and things running on your machine. I might want to come in here and say, I only want to see stuff from Edge, or I only want to see stuff from a particular Firefox instance. So that's really helpful. I can also make easy modifications. So if I go back, let's pull up our default site here. And I'm going to hit Control F5. If I look at this again in the inspectors, you can see it says it's encoded. I'm using compression. So I'm just going to show you how I could use a filter to turn that off. So the way that that works, if I go back here, whenever a web browser sends to a server, it sends this accept encoding header on the request. That's the browser telling the server, I know how to do compression. So what I can do in here, I can actually go into the filters tab and say, anytime you see a request going to a server, I want you to delete that request header. I don't want accept encoding to get sent because I want to see what happens then on the client and how the server reacts. So let me clear this stuff out and we'll make that request again. If I hit Control F5 and I go back and I look at the inspector, you'll see it's no longer compressed. I'm going to use that example throughout here, various ways to use Fiddler to adjust that. I can do as many things as I want. In this case, it's just an easy way to take some headers off and see what happens. I can also hide responses. So if I don't want to see all of the 304 not modified, or maybe I don't want to see authentication demands, I can just filter those out. I can also choose just to see certain type of content. So if I don't want to see images or I only want to see, say, CSS, I can do that as well. Another cool thing I can do, I can block certain types of files. So I'm going to go back here. I just block CSS, and that's what it would look like. Not a surprise, right? But with performance lately, I'm trying to focus on potentially inlining my CSS into the HTML to make one less request. I could use this filter then to prove that I have all of the necessary CSS. So when I hit Control F5, if I've inlined all of the right CSS, this should still look good, even though the rest of my deferred CSS wouldn't load. So it's just kind of a cool way to be able to test that stuff. If you're doing GDPR, it's kind of nice. I can say flag responses that set cookies. So now if I made a request, it'll actually put all of the responses in italics that set cookies. So I can quickly identify who's setting cookies via my site that I might need to deal with. One of the things Eric got a lot of calls and contact about is he said people would turn on filters and forgot they turned them on. And so you can actually come into help and say troubleshoot filters. And what'll happen is if I re-request, it'll show me things that were blocked out. It'll have a strike through. So it's just helpful for me to remember the reason I don't see the request I expect is because I have a filter turned on. So that's just kind of a handy thing if you're having problems. I'm going to turn those off so we can go into our other stuff here. But that is filters. How Fiddler actually got its name, you can use a composer feature and actually fiddle with the requests, which just means what's cool about Fiddler is it's sitting between the browser and the server, so I can actually modify the request before it goes to the server or the response when it comes back. So let's look at why I might want to do that and how that would work. So let's go back here. I'm going to re-request. I can do this manually if I want to, but I'm not bored enough to type out an entire request. So what I'll do instead is I'm going to take my bootstrap request. I can just drop it here. You'll see this was the request that was sent to the server. I can just modify it directly. So again, I can do whatever I want, right? I could change the language and make sure that the web server responds for the appropriate language. I'm just going to use the same example we used before. Now I can just say execute. And if I go look at that request in the inspectors, you'll see again, it's not encoded because I took that signal off from the client. So that's something cool in Composer. And again, that's where, I use DevTools a lot, and there's things that DevTools can do when I troubleshoot. But being able to tweak requests and responses is one of the areas where Fiddler really shines. What I might want to do, I've got this website and I want to, you can come out here and buy a tablet. I'm going to do a checkout here. I do a lot of security testing as well. I want to make sure that my web developer is not just doing client-side validation, but they're doing server-side validation as well. So if I come back to Composer, I can drag that post over. And here's everything that was posted. Well, this is interesting. They're sending the cost of that tablet as a posted parameter. So I'm going to give myself a discount here. I'm going to make that just be $1. And if I hit execute again, and we go back and look at what happened, what should happen is the server shouldn't be taking the cost out of posted data, right? That would allow anybody to cheat. So I'm going to decode that. I'm going to actually look at the raw view, and I'll pop it in the notepad so you can see it. And in the response, it says the order's going to be billed, oops, $1 each, right? So this is really handy. It's not always easy when you're doing security testing or any kind of testing to make the browser or the client do particular things, but it's really simple with Composer. I can just drag, drop, and literally I can change anything I want in the request and be able to see what will happen from a server perspective. Again, with security testing, I often have to execute curl commands. And years ago, I looked all over for where can I get a good Windows curl client that I could trust. And it turns out it was actually built in here the whole time under Scratchpad. I can actually just type a curl command. So if you're familiar with curl, I'm just saying go get www.bing.com. I'll execute that. And if we look at that request, you can see that that was issued by curl Fiddler. So if you need to do curl commands against a server to do some testing to see what would happen, just be aware that there is a curl client built into Fiddler, which is cool. The next way I could change stuff, I can actually use breakpoints. So what I want to do is I want to intercept in Fiddler when I make a request. So let me go down here. There's a quick action down here. What I'm going to type BPU. Bootstrap min.css. So let me zoom in on that because that's a little small. So I'm just telling it down here, I want to set a breakpoint before you make a request for bootstrap min.css. So if we go back and actually execute the page again, let me clear this. Let me finish entering that too. I'm going to hit enter. So now there's a breakpoint set up. If it sees that file name, it's going to wait. So let me go back to our page. I'm going to hit Control F5, and you can see that Fiddler now is glowing because it's sitting right now. It has not actually issued this request yet to the web server. So I have the opportunity, instead of doing it with Composer, I can just manually change that request on the fly and say now run to completion, and you'll see it went to the server, it got the response, and if you notice, it's no longer compressed again because I took that header off. So the breakpoint just lets me do interceptions on the way to the server. So I'm going to type BPU and hit enter again to take that breakpoint off. I can also type BP after site.css and hit enter. So now what's going to happen is when I make a request, I'm not intercepting it on the way to the web server. I'm going to intercept the response coming back from the server before it goes to the client. So if I go in here, you see it's glowing again. It's waiting here. I'm going to actually look at the CSS, and maybe I just want to tweak and say, well, what would it look like if that was the color red instead? So I'll run it to completion. Now, when I go back into the client, you can see what happened. So it's a quick way for me, especially if I don't have access to third-party web servers and such. I can tweak and play with things that are coming back from servers and modify them on the fly by using breakpoints like that. Another thing I use very often is Autoresponder. Because Fiddler is a proxy sitting between my browser and my server, I can actually have Fiddler return information back to the browser without actually contacting the web server. So I've heard of people using this before. If they had a major demo to do, they wanted to make sure it was flawless, you can actually save off your complete web page on my laptop, for instance, and I can set up an autoresponder set of rules that says, if I turn these rules on, please serve off my laptop disk instead of going to the web server. So a nice backup could be, I'll have these web pages sitting on my machine. I want to do the live demo, but if something went wrong, I could come in and turn these rules on. So I'll show you how these rules work and some of the ways that I would use them. So I'm going to go back into Fiddler here. Let me clear this. One thing I want to see is I do a lot of performance testing, and I want to know what would be the impact, for instance, if my CSS file was really slow. Oops. me turn off. I'm going to type BP after and hit enter so I can get rid of that breakpoint. I'm just going to have that run again. So what I want to do is I can go to the Autoresponder tab. I can drag my bootstrap.min.css over, and it's going to create a rule for me. So I'm going to turn rules on, and I'm also going to say unmatched requests pass through. So what's going to happen is any request that matches one of these rules that's enabled will fire. So what I want to do is I want to come up here and I can do anything I want. I could say do a 404. So I'll use this to test, what if a third-party site was dead? I can drag that URL over to Autoresponder and tell it, please return a 404 or a 500 unreadable or whatever I want. In this case, I'm going to set up a delay because I'm curious what would be the user's experience if this were to be delayed. So let's go back. I'm going to hit Control F5. And in a second here, you'll see so this is the experience, right? My customer is sitting waiting because the CSS was delayed. So it may turn out that when I talked about inlining CSS before, I might want to inline just enough CSS to get something to display, just so they're not looking at a blank page. But again, that would be hard to do with other tools, right? I can go in DevTools and say, make everything slow. This lets me very selectively target specific content. So that's kind of cool. The other thing I can do, I can actually take one of the sessions and say, I want to unlock it for editing. Now I'm going to go into the inspectors and I'm actually going to change the content. So let's go in and change the title from just Sydney. We'll do Sydney-RJB. And then I'm going to drag that over to the Autoresponder. Now if I go back and hit Control F5, you'll see that my title's been modified. So again, it's a way for me to, on the fly, yet another way, make modifications to files. And like I said, I can actually do, so I'm a Pluralsight author. They used to have the top 100 courses. I would actually go out to the page and I would bump mine up to, the top 10 just for fun and put myself, maybe not number 1 because that'd be too obvious, but I can put myself high up on that list, save off that HTML on my machine, and then set up an autoresponder rule that just says, please serve this specific file off of the machine. So I can actually go out and search, pick that file. Now anybody using the browser on my machine, when they tried to go to Pluralsight and look at top 100, it would get intercepted by Autoresponder, return my local file, which had me in the top 10. So again, there's a lot of cool things that you can do with this once you know that it's there. So Fiddler today is running on Windows machines. I've got an e-commerce site. We're responsive, and so I need to be able to support phones, tablets, everything. Well, I've got an iPhone. Suddenly my site doesn't work. I have an issue. How am I going to troubleshoot that? Well, what I can do is I can actually still run. So I will set it up to run Fiddler on my Windows machine. Then I can go set up on my phone the proxy for my iPhone. I can set to point at my Windows machine, and then all of the HTTP traffic sent from my iPhone will get routed through my laptop, and then I can do everything I normally want to do in Fiddler. So I'm just going to show you, I don't want to get this all set up, but I'm going to walk you through the basics of how you would do that. So the first thing is I need to come into my Tools, Options, Connections, and make sure I've got Allow Remote Computers to Connect. So I'm saying it's okay on my laptop with Fiddler to expose this port so other people can connect to me. If you're having issues, the way you test, there's an echo service. So I can just hit the localhost 8888, and if everything's working on my laptop, I can see this just fine. I'll figure out the IP address of my laptop. You might have to deal with firewall issues too, just so you're aware. But if I go into iPhones, so you can figure out how to set a proxy. So this is back to where we talked about Fiddler as a proxy, and you might have to point a client at that particular Fiddler instance. So I found the IP address of my laptop, which I put here. It's in a weird place on an iPhone. Usually I was looking for it in Safari, or I run Edge on my iPhone. I'd look in proxy settings there. It wasn't there. It's actually in your Wi-Fi settings. So if you open your Wi-Fi settings on an iPhone and you scroll to the bottom, you can say, please set a manual proxy. So I went on my iPhone, I put the IP address of my laptop, I put the Fiddler port, and then I was just browsing on my phone. You can see, I'm a responsive site. So this is what it looked like with that IP address. And then if I pull up the trace and go look at what those requests look like, you can see I've got iPhone as a user agent. So I'm actually able to trace. So I use this constantly, typically at home, where I'm going to set my devices up. It's easier at home to set them all up on the same Wi-Fi network. And then even though I can't run Fiddler on an iPhone, I can route all of the traffic from other devices through my own laptop. So another thing I'll do with that, if you've ever done troubleshooting for somebody at work, if they're having an issue with my site, I really don't want to walk over and install Fiddler on their machine. The reason being, if they can't print 2 days from now, they're going to call me and say, you messed up my printer when you installed Fiddler on my machine. So what I'll often do is I'll actually go on their machine and I'll tweak their proxy settings myself. I'd rather change their proxy setting to point at my machine. So again, I can just come in here and say I want to use it. I can type my laptop IP address and port and actually route their laptop traffic now through Fiddler as well, or if they have a Mac or whatever. That way I don't have to install stuff on their machine. So that's another way to trace other devices. If you can't set a proxy on your device, there is an alternative. If you look in the Fiddler docs, it's called reverse proxy. It's a little more involved. I'll show it to you during Fiddler script later. It's not too difficult, but it's another way if you can't set a proxy on your machine to still route traffic through Fiddler. Talk about some common issues that people run into. There's a couple areas down on the bottom of the screen here you'll see. So let me pull up the site again. I hit Control F5. You can see I'm tracing traffic. Often when I'm done capturing what I want, I will come to the lower left and turn off capturing. I just don't want other requests to come through because I already have what I want to do. And then of course later on I forget that I did that. I hit Control F5. I come back into Fiddler. There's no new requests. What's going on? Why is Fiddler not working? So if you do this, you just have to remember to turn on capturing again. You can also do where I could pick this any process and drop it on one of the particular browser instances. And you can see in the up where I started, it says Explorer 7692. It will only trace traffic then from that specific version of Edge. So if I were to do that, I might have to come up here and click again just to make it do any process. Because what people will do is they'll do that. They'll close that browser instance. They'll open a new one. They'll try to trace and they're not seeing anything and they don't know why. And that's because they did this. And I can also limit here to all processes, or I just have this set for web browser tracing. So just check those things because you might have accidentally set those and not be able to see. Another thing people will ask me, I'm an ASP.NET developer, so I might make calls in .NET to third-party HTTP services. The traffic between my browser and my server with ASP.NET will get traced just because the browser understands Fiddler and knows how to do it. But when my ASP.NET is running on my laptop and it calls a third-party service, even though it uses HTTP, that traffic is not proxied by default. So if you happen to be a .NET developer, you can go in your config file and set this. And what this will do is it says tell .NET, any of the .NET classes that use HTTP or HTTPS, I want you to also route through Fiddler. So that's the .NET way to do it. So if you're having issues again and you wonder why your custom software or your tool is not routing through Fiddler even though it should, look into how do you set your proxy setting and manually point it to the 127.0.0.1, port 8888, or if it's another IP address like a remote laptop, you can do that as well. Next, we'll talk about Fiddler script. So what's cool is you saw that manually I could change content on the fly. Well, it might turn out that I don't want to do that manually every time I'm doing something. So there's actually a scripting language. It's called jscript.net. It's kind of JavaScript, but it also is kind of .NET-ish that you can write code in. If you're a JavaScript developer, it'll look very familiar to you. There's just some .NET objects available to you. And what I can do then is I can write stuff in Fiddler script to automatically do things. So I'll just show you a couple examples of how that would work. So I can just go into rules, say customize rules. And if I search, I'm just going to search for my RJB. So there's a method in here called on before request. So I'm going to intercept requests from the browser before they go to the server. And in this case, I'm just writing some JavaScript here that says if the session name, if the request ends in .jpeg, I want to color it yellow. So let me save that. And if I go back and hit Control F5, you can see now those are all yellow. So not only can I change how things look in Fiddler, I can actually make modifications to the file. So the kind of things we saw before, I could take the request headers off. I could actually modify the content. Those kinds of things I can do in Fiddler script. Another thing I might want to do, there's another method in here called onExecAction. So I can tweak, if we go back into here, I'm going to clear this. I'm going to make a request to Bing. And if I look in here, I wrote my own extension called remove host. So if I type RH and then do space www.bing.com, I just wanted a quick way, and it's not built into Fiddler, to say I don't want to see all of this particular host, so please just remove it. So if I type RH and then www.bing.com, you'll see it took all of the bing.com requests out. And again, that I just used Fiddler script, wrote a little bit of code here, created my own new quick action. So it's just a nice way to be able to extend functionality with Fiddler, just to be able to add capabilities that I didn't have before. There are a lot of good Fiddler extensions. So if you look at the URL here, you can actually get add-ons to Fiddler. So I just wanted to show you that people do write these. There's a couple of them that are handy, so I'm just going to walk you through some of these. So the first one I might want to do, if I go back and look at my default page, again, for performance reason, I'm using minified JavaScript files. Well, it turns out if I want to troubleshoot, I might want to be able to see what those files have. So I can actually go get this JavaScript formatter. I'll say make JavaScript pretty. And if I hit Control F5, you'll see now it's highlighted these two. And if you look on the right, it's now been unminified, if that's such a word, right? It's not the true source at this point, but it's gone and taken it. So now when I go back to the browser and I go into DevTools, I know that I can go in DevTools and pretty print, but I'd have to do it individually for every JavaScript file. Instead, Fiddler is sitting in between, unminifying it all. So now when I go back into DevTools on the client, I can just start doing my JavaScript debugging, and it'll be something I can step through and it won't be minified. So that's kind of cool. The next one is the gallery. So this extension I installed, it lets me just pick a number of images, and it just shows all of the thumbnails of those images all at once. So it's just a handy way for me to be able to see and interact with particular images that were made during that request. The last one I like, I'm going to turn this off, is called Show Image Bloat. So if you're familiar with, I take a picture on my phone or on my camera, it usually embeds metadata into that image. And that metadata will be things like, oh, you shot this on a Canon and here's the shutter speed. Well, that's all interesting, but not useful from a web perspective. I'm basically weighing down that image file with stuff that doesn't visually change how it looks. So my customers don't care about that. What this image bloat does is it will go find, I'm going to hit Control F5. It finds images that have metadata in them. So if you look, my small thumbnail for London here, it's actually 10K of the 23K is metadata. So 43% of the download required for that image is wasted because the person's never going to actually look at that. So let me go show you what I mean. So if I pull up the London here, if I go to details, you can see there's all my camera information. That's all the metadata that I don't need. I happen to use a tool called JPEG-Tran, which will strip out that metadata. So you can see I've done it on my other images. I just forgot to do it on here. So that extension is really cool because I can quickly hit a website and see here are all the images that have too much metadata. You can also write your own. So if you're ambitious, I've actually written extensions in C# for .NET, and then I can let people download. I have not published any of them, but I've had them for my own uses. So just be aware that's something that you can do. Another cool thing with Fiddler, non-technical people. If I, for instance, had a senior vice president of marketing that had a problem on her machine, I wasn't able at the time to set her proxy settings because they were locked out. There's actually a tool called Fiddler Cap. So I'm just going to show you what that looks like. You can download this. It's meant for getting non-developers an easy way to do a trace for you. So if they open this, it's going to make it really easy for them. I can say, please make sure you decrypt, make sure that you clear out your cookies, clear your cache. Now they can just hit Start Capture. They can go visit whichever site. They can come back. They can hit Stop Capture. Another cool thing, I know this never happens to you, happens to me. They say, gee, your website doesn't work. Well, why? What was wrong? I don't know. It didn't look right. Well, not extremely helpful. They can actually come in and take a snapshot. So when I hit snapshot, it actually took a capture of the page in the browser and embedded into this capture. So now when they hit Stop Capture and save, now they can actually save off this entire session and email it to me. And that way I can open it up in actual Fiddler. It'll look exactly the same to me in Fiddler as if they had used Fiddler. It's just a lot more convenient for someone who's not very technical to be able to go do the things I need them to do, like making sure your cache is clear and decrypt the HTTPS. It's a lot easier for them to use. Some miscellaneous things. We talked about saving off response files. So let's see how to do that. I'm going to reopen a Fiddler instance here. And we'll go back and ask for our page again. Hit Control F5. So what I can do is I can either right click and save off an individual response file if I wanted to. I can save all of these sessions. So you saw with Fiddler Cap, you can do this. I'm going to save off, just give it a name. One of the cool things I can do when I do the save, if I'm going to email this to a third party, it may have sensitive things in here, especially if I'm decrypting HTTPS. I can actually choose and say I want it to be password protected. Now when I give it a name, it's going to pop up and say, please give me a passphrase. So if I type a good long passphrase, it's going to use AES encryption. So I do a lot of cryptography. It's either 128-bit by default, or you can configure it to be 256-bit AES encrypted for that file. So now you can safely send it an email, host it somewhere, and only the person that has the corresponding password will be able to do that decryption. So that's a nice feature when you have to send to third-party people. There's also a text wizard. So as a web developer, you'll find yourself often where you've got a piece of content and you want to see what does that look like base64 encoded, or URL encoded, or hex encoded, or what's the hash values. So it's just got a quick way to do conversions directly in the tool, which is handy. You can write your own inspectors. So if we looked at the inspector list, we've been using this to troubleshoot content like Fiddler knows how to do CSS, how to do JavaScript. If I had a custom type that was familiar just to my company, I could actually go write my own inspector, and it would become a tab here so that my custom data format I could make look however I wanted, which is kind of handy. I will mention Fiddler Core. So Fiddler Core, if I wrote a .NET program, I could basically embed the basics of Fiddler, kind of a headless version of Fiddler. So it'll do tracing and all the stuff we talked about without the user interface. So I could actually embed it directly into my own .NET code, which is kind of cool. I can tweak the user agent. So if for some reason, so I have a hybrid app, and when I use my hybrid app, I want to send a certain user agent. That's how the server knows that I'm the hybrid app. I could come and just type in a user agent, or I could come here and say I want to act like I'm an iPhone, 6. Looks like, obviously these are a little outdated for things, but I can steal whatever user agent I want, put it in custom, and I'm going to look like that user agent when I submit things to the server, which is helpful. We talked about the quick exec area. If you like command line settings, there's a lot of things I can do down here. So I can type greater than 50,000 bytes. So it's going to highlight all of the responses that were greater than 50,000. I can do less than 1,000 bytes. So these are all the ones that were smaller. I can look for CSS. Had something wrong with my syntax there. I can type CLS to clear the screen, which is handy. So there's just a lot you can look in the help. There's a lot of things that you can do at the command line. If you like using command line interfaces, it's a quick way to make modifications to things. And as you saw, you're also able to extend and add your own. Another thing I use quite often is called host remapping. So if you're familiar, there's a site called example.com that's hosted. Sometimes I want to look like in the browser I'm a different URL than where I really want to go to, and I can use host remapping for that. So if you see, I'm telling it if anybody ever types example.com, I really want you to serve it from localhost port 86. So if I save that and go back and hit Control F5, now I'm actually serving the site you've seen that's running on my local IIS, but it looks like it's example.com. So I use this often if I need to do a stage versus production for my website. I don't want to tweak all of the code. I can actually say that I'm production from a browser perspective and yet send it to my stage server. So I can just tweak and do some of that host remapping stuff very conveniently within Fiddler itself. I'm going to turn that back off. Talked about Fiddler Everywhere. So they're basically rewriting Fiddler Classic, which is a Windows app that's been around forever that you're probably all familiar with. They're rewriting and reimagining it to run multi-platform for Windows, Linux, and Mac. It's in an early beta version. You can go out here to get it. I will just start it quickly just so you can see what it looks like. There's a lot of capabilities. You actually sign in with an ID so you can collaborate and share things online. I'm actually going to close normal Fiddler. So this is going to kick open. It's pretty early. I mean, they're adding a lot of features as you go. They've got the ability to do HTTPS decryption. Like I said, I'm able to save off traces. You can see the interface is a little different than it was before, but they're trying to basically upgrade, make a whole new user experience, bring the best of Classic forward, and they continue to work on this. I've met the team. They're doing a lot of good work on trying to transform it for a new user interface and be multi-platform. Some quick resources. Like I said, I've got 2 Pluralsight courses. The most recent one is how to troubleshoot your website using Fiddler and, in this case, Chrome developer tools. So I just walk through common scenarios where your website is broken, JavaScript, CSS, performance. How do you use either Fiddler or devtools as appropriate to figure out what's wrong with your site? My original course on Fiddler goes into a lot of the details about creating your own extensions, inspectors, the kind of things we went through today. Eric actually wrote a book, Debugging with Fiddler. 2nd edition's out. I probably read it at least 10 different times. I mean, every time I go through that, I find things that I didn't realize from before or that I had forgotten. So if you really want to get serious about Fiddler, I mean, he wrote it. You can get a lot of details about how specific things work and a lot of edge cases that we haven't even covered in this. That's my Twitter, my email, my blog information. That's a link to the slides and the code. So at this point, I'm ready if anybody has any specific questions that you would like to go through.
Nice. Thank you very much, Robert.
You're welcome.
That was a great talk. Let me see. I don't see any direct questions. I think it's a good sign, though, not a negative.
That's
I think
good.
I think it was very clear.
Good. Thank you.
Very extensive. Saw some great examples in there. How came your? I think you stated it shortly in the beginning, but I'm sorry, I got it out quickly. How come that you became this interested in this topic? Actually, yeah.
Primarily, so years ago, like I said, I used Netmon. So I would have a problem with my website. I'd use Netmon, which is kind of the Wireshark of the day. It wasn't easy to construct things because it was at a packet level. So if I were to go show you in Fiddler again, when I make a particular request, it's nice because it's very easy for me to see the whole request and the whole response in one place. If you use something like Wireshark or Netmon, those kind of tools, you kind of have to construct, like this might be 5 packets worth of data. Really it came to me that, I have a problem with my real website. People at work are saying you need to fix it. I needed a tool that let me figure out what's going on, right? And how do I do some of the things like, what happens if my CSS is slow, right? How do you simulate that? Or how do you check that your security is right? Are you doing server-side validation? There were just things that every day I needed to do that I just gravitated to this tool. And as I got to know more of these features, I've just grown over the years on all the capabilities that I can take advantage of to figure out things that are wrong or potentially wrong. So another, for instance, I use a CDN to host all my content. I put my CSS files out there. That unfortunately my CDN had a hiccup one day and it wasn't sending my CSS files. Well, then I learned through Fiddler then that I could actually simulate CSS failure, and I wrote fallback code. So if the CDN isn't available, it'll come to my server to get the CSS. It was easy to simulate that failure in Fiddler with Autoresponder and make sure that my fallback code worked. So now if my CDN ever dies, I still get all the CSS like I did before. It's going to be a little slower, but it's not going to be a blank page, if that makes sense. So yeah, that's kind of,
nice.
I'm a full-time web developer and I have problems too, right? And I need to figure out why. So that's why I've gravitated to this.
Nice, very interesting. Yeah, I think it's a very interesting topic. I don't think it's highlighted enough, to be honest. Because well, in general topics, you don't really hear a lot about it, to be honest. So I think it was really nice to see, or to see it from a perspective with somebody that really uses it this intensively.
Yeah, I hope, like I said, I'm at a lot of conferences and people come up to me and say, well, how do you figure out whatever? And I'll say, have you used Fiddler? And they say, yeah. And I say, what do you use it for? And they've done the basic tracing. But I said, do you know that you can make your thing intentionally slow and see what happens? And no, I've never seen that, just because it's not obvious. There's a lot of tabs in there. And if you haven't gone actively looking for it, you don't know that the stuff is there. So it's just, 10 years plus of me suffering and then trying to bring it forward with this, this I hope helps people. hopefully you'll see something you can use.
Preventing the suffer on other
Yes,
ones.
that's what I'm trying.
All right. I don't see any direct questions, but we're going to upload this talk on the YouTube channel. It will also be published in our newsletter. So without doubt, there will be some questions following up on it.
Okay.
If you see this talk right now, because it's being published at a later stage, you can contact Robert on this side of the screen. Yes, on this side of the screen.
Yep.
Via boedi.dev or robert@boedi.dev, or just via Twitter @boedi. If you want to see more talks from us, please subscribe below on the subscribe button. I don't know if you have anything else to add, Robert.
No, I think that's all I've got for today.
That's great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for making your time, and we hope to have you back post-COVID, perhaps in Amsterdam.
That would
and
be
otherwise
awesome.
for sure, and otherwise for sure again online.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Stay healthy, stay safe.
Yeah, you too. Thanks.
Thanks.